All right, let's kick this off. Welcome once again, everyone. I'm Jonathan Sriranganathan. I'm one of the conveners of the Queensland Greens Participatory Democracy Circle. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. I'd like to start by acknowledging country and paying respects to the Yagara and Turrbal peoples whose land I'm currently coming at you from. And on behalf of everyone on this call, just want to pay our respects to all First Nations people and acknowledge that there's a lot left to do in terms of standing in solidarity with First Nations people, and that really needs to be at the center of all our political activism. We're really excited today to have Amy MacMahon join us for a discussion about participatory democracy. I'll introduce Amy in a sec, but broadly, the question we're exploring today is, can we and should we give Greens members or supporters or the wider public a more meaningful say on how Greens MPs vote on controversial bills in Parliament? So many of you will be aware that over the last few years, there have been some tricky moments in Green politics where our MPs are called upon to decide whether to vote in favour of a government bill, maybe like a Labor Party bill, that in some ways lines up with Greens policy, but doesn't completely line up with Greens policy. And that often means that MPs are making very tricky decisions about how best to further the party policy platform. So Greens members will be aware that Greens policies are drafted through some pretty long and onerous grassroots participatory democracy processes. So policies are developed often by branches, people make suggestions, they go to state council, they get workshopped. There's a very robust and often time-intensive process for the party to develop policies. But when politicians are deciding how they vote in Parliament, often the policies don't provide enough guidance. The policy might say, we want this, but the bill that the government has put forward only gets us halfway there. So there are really interesting strategic questions about whether our Greens politicians should support that bill, which isn't quite what Greens are calling for, but maybe gets us a bit closer, or whether they should refuse to support it and hold out for bigger changes. A really obvious example of this is from the last few years at the federal level with the housing bills that Labor was putting forward, which weren't really delivering what Greens policy goals are after, but arguably did get us closer to increasing the supply of affordable housing. And after a lot of back and forth and member surveys, etc., we saw our Greens MPs basically vote in favour of most of those housing bill proposals. But that decision was made after a lot of consultation with Greens members. There were surveys, there were public forums, but Greens members didn't have the final say or even a direct vote. So what we're exploring today is not should politicians consult Greens members or the wider public, but it's can we give members or supporters or just members of the constituency in general, can we give them a meaningful say, maybe some kind of voting mechanism to actually determine how our Greens MPs vote in Parliament? And we've had a couple of examples of this, both in Australia in the Greens context, but also from around the world, of different kinds of referendums. And next month, we're going to be having a specific presentation from another Participatory Democracy Circle member, Stephen, about referendums. But this today is about the practical question of whether we can give people a vote to guide how our MPs vote in Parliament. And to sort of kick off that discussion, we're going to be hearing from Amy MacMahon, who was the former Greens State MP for the electorate of South Brisbane on Brisbane's in the south side. Amy served in the Queensland Parliament for a 4-year term, and during that time, there was at least one example where the Greens did use direct member vote to guide how Amy and our other Greens MP, Michael Berkman, decided to vote in Parliament. So, yeah, we're going to be hearing from Amy a bit for about 10 minutes. Then I'll be putting some questions to her. Then we'll open it up to questions from the group, and then we'll have a broader open discussion. So during group questions, stick to questions, and then we'll have plenty of time for open discussion towards the second half of the session. But right now, hopefully you can join me in twinkling your fingers and welcoming Amy MacMahon to the discussion. Over to you, Amy.
Hi, thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge I'm joining from Yagara country and pay my respects to elders past and present, and remember that we are on stolen land and sovereignty was never ceded. And there is also a rally on tomorrow afternoon if you want to push back against the LNP's increasingly racist policing policies that they're introducing. here in Queensland. Yeah, a big thanks to Jono and Holstein for organising this. And to give us all an opportunity to reflect on the ways in which we make decisions within the Greens and how this filters through for our MPs. I would say for the vast majority of bits of legislation that Michael has been dealing with, or that I was dealing with, there was an easy response if we went back to look at Greens policy. And Greens policy has the benefit of being developed by members, and we can feel confident when we are lining up Greens policy alongside bits of legislation, knowing that these policies have been democratically decided by Greens members. And for the vast majority of pieces of legislation, the Greens policy is able to direct us in a particular direction. And that will influence how we engage with bills, whether we speak to bills, whether we vote for or against, whether we try and put amendments, whether we abstain as well. There's an interesting balance, I think, to reflect on between the responsibility that Greens MPs have to the Greens members and the responsibility that MPs have to their own electorates as well. And we in South Brisbane put a lot of time and effort into making sure we were consulting with the local community. We did a lot of surveys. We would do a lot of community forums, a lot of community meetings. We occasionally did door knocking to make sure that we had a good sense of what people on the ground in our electorates were after when we were deciding on particular directions. And the Gabba Stadium campaign is one example of that. We put a lot of time and effort into making sure that we knew what community members on the ground felt. We did also do a survey of Greens members very early on to determine our sort of overall approach to the Olympics, whether we are for or against the Olympics. I personally am very anti-Olympics, but the membership came back with a bit more of a sort of mixed response. And the community came back with a mixed response, but with a very heavy focus on making sure we were pushing back against the Gabba Stadium. And we obviously don't have any direct policies about the Olympics, but a lot of our policies direct us towards ways we can be approaching the Olympics: anti-privatisation, the kind of misuse of public money, corporatisation of sport, and obviously in this case the impact on a state school and the Greens sort of commitment to a state school. So Greens policy was largely pointing us in the right direction, but that final Green stance on the Olympics, I think we are still sort of balancing between a for or against. And that was largely because of the feedback we got from members and the feedback we were getting from the local community as well. So I think that's one example where we very clearly had to be doing both of those bits of consultation. And for the vast majority of other bills, the Greens policy provides us a pretty good platform for what we should be doing. Jono had given the example of the coercive control bill as one particular case study for where Greens policy was not particularly clear on this bill. Just let me have a sip of water. So you might remember this. This was a bill that came out of the then Labor government's broader women and girls strategy, and they did quite a lot of consultation, 2 rounds of consultation on developing some kind of key tenets in a women's and girls strategy, and that was including domestic violence responses, and in this case the decision by the government to criminalise coercive control. Coercive control is behaviour from partners where they are using psychological means or other means to influence the behaviour of their partner in a controlling way, and provides a pattern of behaviour that often leads into more physically violent domestic violence. And you would all remember the example of Hannah Clark, who was killed with her children by her partner, who had engaged in years of coercive control behaviour. And it makes sense that this would be something that that would be part of a suite of responses to responding to domestic violence. How do you clearly say coercive control is bad, and if you shouldn't do it, and if you do it, there are penalties. In this case, criminal penalties. And I think like Greens policy, it doesn't tell us directly what we would do here, but we do have a kind of broad approach in the Greens where we are critical of the role of policing. We're critical of a justice system that doesn't always deliver justice. We are critical of the kind of racist ways that the criminal justice system is applied, and just kind of generally cautious on the way that things are or are not criminalised. One of the things that the Queensland government are dealing with now is they are looking to recriminalise public drunkenness, which was something that came out of the Royal Commission into Deaths in Custody to say that that public drunkenness should be decriminalised as a way to reduce people's contact with the police, and the LNP are now looking to recriminalise that. Now, I think in that case, the Greens would certainly be against recriminalising coercive control, recriminalising, public drunkenness. But for coercive control, it doesn't necessarily, we don't generally have an approach that would point us in one way to say criminalisation is good or bad. I think we would all have our own opinions on increasing criminalisation, but Greens policy for coercive control is silent. So on top of that, we were getting very conflicting feedback from various different stakeholder groups about what they thought was the right path forward. And we were speaking with a lot of First Nations groups, we were speaking with legal groups, we were speaking with domestic violence groups, we were speaking with NGOs who support people involved who've suffered from sexual violence. And we were getting very different feedback on what people thought was the right thing to do. Some groups saying, no, this shouldn't be criminalised. This will just increasingly put people at risk of the violence of our criminal justice system. Some groups were saying there's a risk that the victims will inadvertently be criminalised for coercive control, and we certainly know examples of where women have called the police for help with domestic violence, and then they themselves have been arrested once the police show up. So it's not crazy to think this couldn't be turned around. And just a general wariness of criminalising what is often like very subtle behaviour that builds up to create a bigger picture. And the legislation itself was kind of, they were having to weave this path between, like, they weren't criminalising like specific actions of coercive control, but criminalising a broader like demonstration of behaviour that would then be criminalised, and the way in which that police would be able to engage with that. So we were getting this feedback from community groups and other community groups saying, definitely criminalise coercive control, and a lot of groups saying at the very least this will be used as an education tool to be able to talk to people about why coercive control is bad and what coercive control is. I would say there would still be a lot of people out there who wouldn't know what coercive control is, and they wouldn't know that it's criminalised. And so, like, one of the tools of the law, of legislation, is being used as an education tool, as a way to communicate to people, this is bad and we don't want people to do this, and there's penalties if you do engage with this, as a way to help, as a way to kind of bring people along. So we were stuck with this kind of murky area where the Greens policy wasn't clear, where the feedback we were getting from community groups often wasn't clear. Actually, often, like, one of the first things we do when we get a piece of legislation after it's been through an inquiry is to go through the list of people who've made submissions. And this is often really helpful because there's community groups who will be experts on a particular area of the law who will have been able to interpret this legislation very thoroughly and will often give us some clues about the kinds of things we should be pushing for, or should we be speaking about in our speeches, directing how we should vote, if we should be moving amendments. And that kind of like one of the key things that we do is go through these submissions. And when the submissions weren't clear and we were getting different sorts of feedback, that's when we actually went to the Parliamentary Liaison Committee, which is a committee that was set up for exactly this purpose, is to connect Greens MPs with the party membership. The PLC is a democratically voted body. It hasn't always worked quite the way that we intended, but it exists there, and it exists there as potentially the basis for how we could proceed with consultation or with a member's vote of some kind. And so we'd gone to PLC and we said, well, this is the issue that we've got. The feedback we're getting from the community groups is not clear. Greens policy isn't clear. And so they helped us run a survey of members. And this was in, I think, late 2023. And we had 194 responses from Greens members, which isn't that many when you think about how many members have we got in Queensland, actually. I wonder if anyone knows off the top of their head.
It's about 2,700 currently. So,
yeah,
less than 10% of members.
Less than 10%, yeah. And the feedback came back overwhelmingly in support of criminalising coercive control. There was 83% of responses said to criminalise coercive control, and 16.5% said otherwise. And as part of that survey, we also there was like a written section, and there was lots of people who had taken the opportunity to write in this section, and people were stressing the need for more funding for frontline and essential services. And I think a lot of people were saying, you know, criminalising is one thing, but if you don't have the support, if you don't have the education that is backed up with this, like criminalising it on its own isn't going to achieve what you want. And actually, we know that the actual way we will address things like coercive control is better frontline services, a lot more investment in education, a lot more investment in the kind of things you educate kids on in school, having access to support services for both victims and perpetrators. We know what the bigger picture is in terms of actually addressing like things that are currently criminalised, and a lot of Greens members were saying that as well. So that gave us, I think, a pretty good direction for how we could approach this and the kinds of things we talked about in our speeches. And Michael and I were both able to stress, like, these are all the other things that you need to do if you actually want to get rid of coercive control and be investing in these frontline services, investing in things like housing, making sure our essential services, healthcare and schools are genuinely free, and the way in which that feeds into a bigger picture. So that's kind of one of the examples of where that was really helpful. And this was like, I remember feeling very, very like stressed about this, and getting this feedback from the membership at least gave us some direction about the way to go. Even though, like, I still have like my hesitancies on whether coercive control should be criminalised, but I think we were able to outline our speeches like, well, you need to have all these other systems in place, and being able to have the evidence from members was helpful in being able to direct us through that. So that's one example. I'm not the expert on this, but I wanted to also just touch a bit more on what Jonah had mentioned around the housing bills, because I think that was another example of very thorough consultation with members, and that even then went a step further to be mobilising members to be talking about this bill and to be getting feedback on what people thought that the Greens should be doing. And you'd remember that Max's team organised door knocking right around the country, people who are going out and saying, these are the two bills, these are the bills before Parliament at the moment, and this is what the Greens are thinking about, and this is what we're pushing, and this is why we are trying to negotiate for better elements in these bills. And those two things together, like that kind of forming that consultation with the members on top of mobilising people for action, and had that extra layer of being able to go out and talk to people in the community and also get feedback from people on what they thought the Greens should do next. And like, I'm not sure the party's ever done anything like that on that kind of scale. And that is just it's a great example of what we could be thinking about doing down the track for other bits of legislation that are going to affect large numbers of people who are struggling with the housing crisis, and being able to break through the kind of media blackout that the Greens often face, to be able to talk to people directly and say, this is the legislation, this is what's in it, and this is how the Greens want to respond. What do you think? And so that sort of links back to the early example I had around the Olympics, where we were trying to consult both with the members and to vote with community groups as well. So that is my speedy overview. Happy to take any questions or comments.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Amy. So we'll open up to questions from the broader group shortly. I really appreciated those insights you were sharing. I guess my first question was in regards to the coercive control decision. Did you and Michael as MPs have your personal opinions? And if like the membership had voted completely differently, or let's say it had been pretty close and it was like a 45-55% split, do you think was your intention that you would treat the results of the vote as kind of binding, or were you sort of seeing where it went and then maybe your personal opinion would come into it a bit as well?
I think it would have been less so our personal opinions and more so the combination of like the feedback from members and what the community groups were saying. And I think if the vote of members had come back a lot tighter, we might then have tried to do some I'm trying to think
like forums or stuff.
Yeah. I think we might have even done I think there was a workshop at State Council. I don't know if anyone remembers. Rowena's got their hand up.
Yeah, I attended the information forums that you held. So actually, the survey was combined with an open forum for members to attend and discuss. And so that had already been scheduled as part of the survey going out. So the basis of that forum was you sharing the results and explaining that they were quite resoundingly in one way, but then deeply discussing the things and really pulling out like what would be said. So I would imagine that would have had a different character.
Yeah.
But I do want to just say, like, it was awesome that it was included already in the idea.
Thanks for that, Rowena.
Really
good.
great.
Yeah, appreciate that insight.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, that's right. We did. I think we did. Was it online? We did an online forum. Yeah, so that was baked in there as well. So yeah, I think if the survey results had come back a lot closer, maybe then that session with members would have sort of helped guide it further.
And I guess related to that, Amy, there's this sort of, you alluded to it yourself, that like having almost 200 members voting on a question is kind of better than just you and Michael and your staff making the decision, which is probably the alternative. Like from where I look at it, I would rather that a couple of hundred members are turning their mind to it and thinking about it and making an informed decision rather than just the politicians by themselves. But how many members would have had to vote for you to give the result legitimacy, or did you have a threshold in mind, or was it just like, let's try it and see how many people participate? I can imagine that the higher the participation rate was, the more confidence you would have had in going with that view from members. Hey, but what if only like 20 members had voted? Would you have still paid much attention to the result?
I think if only 20 members had responded, we would have tried something different.
Yeah.
Like I feel like we would have then gone back to members and like done
and said, check your emails, guys.
Please do this survey. Because that like wouldn't have been like, occasionally we would do surveys and we'd look at like some of the variables around statistical I kind of remember the term now, but like that factor within a survey that tells you like, oh, this is kind of telling you what this broader group.
Yeah, whether it's statistically representative.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I hope that if that had been different, that we would have gone back. And I think the other thing to mention is like, it certainly would have been myself and Michael and our staff, but we were often in a lot of communication with various community groups. We would have been in communication with the PLC, and Michael and I were still having to come back to State Council to report on things that we were doing. So, like anything that might have been decided just by Michael, myself, and our staff would have been things that were very clearly laid out in Greens policy, and anything beyond that, there would be like different sorts of consultation that we were engaging in.
I think I'm remembering back, and this is, I think this meeting was kind of confidential, but I don't think it really matters now, that I remember being on a PLC meeting, a Parliamentary Liaison Committee meeting, where you and Michael and sort of the Greens leadership were deciding at the time whether to support the extension of some of the COVID health and safety measures, which in some senses made a lot of sense because the COVID was still in the community and we needed to sort of encourage social distancing and capacity limits and some. But in other ways, that legislation was quite onerous and draconian in terms of the level of interference with human rights and the sort of the exceptions that were carved out for the casino and all that sort of stuff. And you and Michael were facing a somewhat tricky decision about whether to support or whether to not support. And in the end, I think you decided, we're not going to support the laws being extended for another, whatever it was, 3 or 6 month period. But that to me felt like a case where I'm sure members would have had some interesting insights. And even within our little committee, there was a diversity of views about whether to keep the powers intact or whether to. And I remember thinking at the time, I'm like, this would have been a really good one to hold a public vote on, but it was also such a polarizing issue, and the sort of issue where like there was a lot of misinformation and toxic rhetoric out in public. So it also matters to some extent what the broader public discourse is and whether there's space for a public vote and a mature conversation, which I guess brings me to the question of, what are the factors that you think MPs should be keeping in mind when they're deciding whether or not to have a vote on these sorts of controversial bills? And you've sort of touched on the fact that you had conflicting views from different stakeholders and that the policy itself was a bit silent. So yeah, what are the sort of factors you weigh up? But I guess then also like, how much information do you feel you need to provide to people before they vote? Like, because I thought the coercive control bill was a good example. You had some links to submissions. You said, here's what some stakeholders are saying. Here's a summary of what some of the opposing stakeholders are saying. And you really encouraged members to read that stuff. And as Rowena pointed out, you also had an online workshop. So yeah, what are the factors you think of when you're deciding whether to put something to a vote, and how much information do you think you need to give to people to ensure that the vote will be well informed?
Yeah, I think like it would come down to those bills where as I said, where the Greens policy is silent, where the submissions that we've been seeing from community groups would be, not a consistent view, and maybe if things were being talked about in the media a particular way, but we have certainly made decisions that the media didn't like. Like if you think about the CFMEU bill, for example, like that was something that, like, there was a lot of media about it, and our response was going to be sort of coloured by like a broader media landscape that that if we'd just been paying attention to the media, we would have just like waved those bills through. But based on Greens policy on the role of unions and like the democratic nature of unions, and the fact that that legislation was like truly appalling in its overreach, directed us to vote in one way. But like, I think a lot of people would say, well, in hindsight, because of the media backlash, like, we shouldn't have done that. But I think like we were very clearly directed through Greens policy on what to do there and what the right path forward was. So I think like that would be the one other factor, is like a broader kind of media landscape that's going on about bits of legislation. But that wouldn't necessarily be the thing that is directing us one way or another. It would be the thing that what might signal to us like this is a controversial thing that we will need to be careful about. And I don't know if with the CMFMU bills, if we'd gone back to the membership, we don't know because we didn't do it. But I would say that the membership would have been opposed to those bits of legislation as well. And if we had the time to consult with members. And that's one of the other tricky factors, actually. At times, like, we were like really controversial things that were being the CFMEU stuff was introduced on Tuesday and it was passed on Wednesday, and that was the amount of time that we had. Didn't like have any other time, like, and then bills will go through at various lengths, usually like about 3 months. But some things would be getting dealt with much quicker, maybe a few weeks, or in that case, literally overnight.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, because I think this is one of the big challenges to do participatory democracy meaningfully, where people aren't just mindlessly voting, but they've had time to digest the information, where there's enough time for people to cast their vote and to get the emails and all that sort of stuff. You do need a little bit of lead time. And while I can imagine that if you've got your system set up, it only takes maybe a couple of hours to draft your question, to get the email out to people ready, to pull together a bit of explanatory information. Like, that's still probably a half a day to a day's work at least. And then you need to give people time to respond to the vote. And as you say, sometimes votes come on really, really quickly without any notice from the government. I've had that experience as a councillor as well, where the Liberals would move local laws or move budget amendments or whatever at very short notice, where I didn't feel I had time to consult my constituency. And often in those cases, I would just abstain. And I would just say in council, look, I'm not going to vote yes or no on this bill because I haven't had enough time to talk to my community. So I'm not voting. But I didn't have balance of power in those situations. So me abstaining wasn't perhaps as big a thing. But I think it's safe to say that most of the time, well, maybe it's not safe to say, but often for the standard process for bills is that they're introduced, there's usually multiple readings, they're sometimes referred to committee. There's usually a bit of notice and lead time for bills, right? Like, it's kind of the exception that a piece of controversial legislation is rushed through really quickly. Is that fair to say? Or
I would say the controversial stuff is put through quickly.
Yeah, like, right.
Anything that is given a longer period of time is not controversial, or is not controversial in terms of like what our
position is. Yeah.
To it. Yeah. But like the CFMEU stuff turned around very quickly. You might remember that the amendment that Labor made to have rent increases limited to 1 year, and I think that was moved as an amendment and passed in a day. They had done no consultation on it, and
but you didn't have a casting vote on that, hey? They didn't need. We
didn't have a casting vote on anything, though,
no.
John.
Yeah,
We didn't like that. I think that's the other thing to remember. Like, the Greens at the Queensland level, with no upper house, no Senate, like, our vote didn't matter. but it did matter in terms of like how we were
what it signals.
representing our communities,
Yeah.
and like how we were representing the broader Greens movement, and how we understand like the way in which we use Parliament as kind of a tool for change in and of itself. Even if we don't have that institutional power, we've got the kind of discursive power and like building community movements and connecting with people. But yeah, like at the state level, like it makes no material difference.
Yeah, I get you.
Which is, yeah, I mean, and this will be like a more serious question when and if we get more Greens in Parliament and we actually being able to make those decisions, and perhaps at the federal level where the Greens do now have the balance of power in the Senate, how that is being used, and the decisions that they might be making on like, okay, what bills do we bargain on or try to bargain on, and what other bills are we letting through,
Well
like
said,
that. And
yeah.
we have seen that has been like the Greens have been very criticised for the way in which we have used our actual little bit of institutional power, even if we've gotten good outcomes for people in the end.
Yeah, really good insights there. I'm mindful of wanting to let a few other people ask questions. So what I'm going to do now is just pause the recording for 30 seconds and let everyone have a quick break from your computer, have a quick stretch. I'm doing this partly because I want people to think about your question before you ask it. So we're going to have a quick 30-second break, and then people can start posting in the chat if you have a question for Amy to answer. Please just keep it to questions for now, and we'll have discussion in a second. Really quick, is that a question from you, Stephen, for after the break? Cool. All right. Pausing recording, back in 30 seconds. All right, let's jump back into it. If people would like to type out your questions in the chat, that'll be a little easier for me to take them. If you can't write your question out, you can use the raise hand function, and I'll ask you to speak your question. But we've already got one coming through in the chat. Thank you for this question. Thinking federally and reflecting on our struggles with Labor's HAF and Help to Buy legislation, do you think surveying the membership might have helped us navigate that? Amy, did you want to speak to this? I certainly have my thoughts, but what do you reckon? We kind of did survey them.
Yeah, I think we did. Like I don't know about this in detail, but my sense was that there was a fair bit of engagement going on with branches, and the feedback coming back from the door knocking that people were doing as well.
Because I think there was a lot of what I would describe as consultation, and including member surveys, survey of the general public, door knocking, branch meetings, some town hall forums that Max ran, but there wasn't an actual vote, and the results of the vote weren't published or publicized. And I remember thinking about this as a member, where like I think I filled out the survey quickly, but it wasn't like a yes, no, how do you want us to vote? In a way that felt like I was making a conscious decision. It was more like, what are your vibes, members? And I personally would have really liked to see a strong vote, and I reckon that would have been a really instructive result. But yeah, I guess we'll never know now. Do you remember, Amy? Was there a vote, or maybe those surveys were only in Queensland, and maybe Greens members in other states didn't really get as much engagement?
I couldn't say, but I know there was door knocking going on in other states too. So there must have been some engagement with branches in other states, but I don't know what that would have looked like.
Yeah, we can come back to this in the discussion because I think it's productive ground for further reflection. The next question in the chat is, how did you combine surveying your constituents and broader Greens members?
Like I think the one key example is the Olympics that I mentioned, where we had done a survey of members, and then we're doing a lot of consultation with the community. And I think that that's one example where like I ended up taking a line that was different to what I actually believed was the right thing to do, or maybe not what I thought was the right thing to do, the thing that I believed myself. And I get the sense from some members and community members who were also like skeptical of the Olympics, but didn't want to be seen as being anti-Olympics. And I think that then that kind of the feedback that we got from the community and from members did influence our approach going forward, even like in that we weren't like out and out criticizing the Olympics. And yeah, I would say there would be other examples where if we were following Greens policy, and like there's probably examples of legislation where we should have done more consultation with our own communities. Like we should have put more effort into like trying to understand what people in the community thought. There was one other example, sorry, that I did want to mention was when we were moving some amendments around affirmative consent, and we held a forum. This was long before the bills were coming to Parliament and long before we drafted our own bill. But we had a forum and we started having some of these discussions locally in the community about what sort of approach we should take to affirmative consent. And I think one of the other things we haven't really touched on here is the processes that we would engage in when we were writing our own bills. So rather than responding to government bills, the bills that we were tabling, and PLC was trying to put together a process for how we would be able to get some feedback on bills that we were going to introduce. And yeah, that's kind of one other part of the question. And I think, again, a place where, like, if there's some good systems in the Parliamentary Liaison Committee, that would be the place to do some of that work.
Yeah, so much to unpack there. I want to make plenty of time for discussion, so we might have to rush through some of these next few questions. The next one in the chat is, do you think speed in bills represents a general political fear of the media controlling a political narrative, or a requirement for people who are often bad communicators to educate the public about an issue? So how do you interpret this question, Amy? Does that make sense to you?
The speed of which bills were introduced and passed, is that the...
Martin, feel free to add into the chat or unmute and flesh out that question. But I think partly you're asking, are they rushing it because they don't want to do a good job of communicating? Yeah, cool. Well, yeah, why are these bills rushed? Is it's because they don't want to make time for a public debate about them, right?
I think that might be part of it, but it could also be like heading off like media attacks. Like if I think about the CFMEU bill, for example, like
there was so much media pressure to do something about this corruption.
Yeah. And the way that bit of legislation was structured was that there was federal legislation, and then the state governments needed to come in with their own little bit about, like, we're going to fuck them federally and we're going to fuck them at the state level. And that all happened really quickly. And I think like the speed at which that bit of legislation went through was like the government worried about a media backlash. And I think if they had given any time to people actually being able to read those bills before they went through, there would have been more
pushback.
More pushback. Not entirely, but I think like if there had been an opportunity to talk to these bills about just how like literally the Queensland bill was like the administrator of the CFMEU is exempt from the Fair Work Act. Just incredible. If people had more than 24 hours to look at this, like it might have been a different response. But I think for governments, like, they're trying to head off something, or with the 12-month rental thing, the government just wanted to be seen to do something. They just wanted something in the media to say, oh, we're on it, like we're doing something for renters. And they went with this thing. And that bit of legislation was also appalling in that their own notes that went along with it said they had done no consultation. They hadn't talked to any community groups, hadn't talked to any renters, like even from the government level, like there's no consultation there. But I'd say like anything that goes through quickly is that the government is trying to like avoid scrutiny or avoid a media backlash.
Yeah, And I do think, yeah, to Martin's question, that the fear of the media and bad coverage does undermine what people feel confident talking about publicly and openly. Like I see this as an elected rep or I saw this as elected rep all the time, that it would be easier to be open with the public and say, these are the challenges we're navigating. These are the arguments for and against. This is why we're on the fence right now. Whereas the media is very unforgiving of indecisiveness, and you can get criticized a lot for fence sitting. Or if you say, well, I support the bill for this reason, but I'm opposed to the bill for that reason, the media will then quote that back to you later and say, well, you said you were opposed to the bill for this reason, but you voted in favour of it, which means that I think Greens MPs included are often really reluctant to state clearly these are the tensions we're grappling with, because you know that those could be cherry picked and taken out of context. Hey, so,
Yeah, that just reminds me, for the coercive control bill, we had put in a submission to the Women's and Girls Task Force about maybe 6 months before that legislation came to Parliament, maybe 12 months, where we had outlined our own concerns about criminalisation of coercive control. So, in a sense, we were already on the public record, and then we did that further consultation when it came to it. But
that's unusual. Like mostly MPs will not put in submissions on government bills or to say where they stand on a thing before it comes to a vote, right? Or
no, I don't think so. And usually there's not that much time to do that.
Thanks. Hey, the next question is, what is the role of technology in enabling participatory democracy? What would be an ideal online system to engage people in parliamentary decision-making processes? You guys just used SurveyMonkey, didn't you, for the coercive
We were
control?
just using SurveyMonkey, yeah. And then, like in terms of digital tools, yeah, SurveyMonkey.
There's other platforms like Bang the Table.
Yeah.
Like for my community voting as a local councillor, we had some volunteers built up a basic system that was able to be used for participatory budgeting, which we might talk about in a future participatory democracy circle session. But I think, like, I don't know if you agree with this, Amy, but in a way, it's those philosophical questions of like, how much weight do you give to the general public versus members? How much time do you need? How many people need to be able to participate for it to be legitimate? I feel like a lot of those questions are more important than what platform do you use, because really the choice of platform is shaped largely by how many people need to be able to participate and how easy does it need to be to participate. And I imagine that for you with the coercive control thing, one of the reasons that you did a member vote rather than just opening it up to the general public is that you might have been worried that people would vote multiple times or that you couldn't control access. Or why was it in that case? Was it a platform thing that led you towards members only vote, or was that just we don't want to open? Like, why didn't you give a vote to everyone in South Brisbane in your electorate?
I think it's because we had a general sense of what the community felt, but we didn't have a clear sense on what Greens members felt. But yeah, I think from like the conversations that we were having with people in the community and the stakeholders. But I mean, that's one example where we didn't do any sort of like, we were talking with community members, but it wasn't like a formalized process to get a feedback from the electorate about what they thought on
and honestly, like 90% of residents in your electorate would have had no idea that bill was happening, right? Like most people aren't that engaged.
No, that's part of the problem.
Yes.
Like broader engagement with politics is something that we have been trying hard to address, like trying hard to, like how do you draw people back into the political process and all sorts of different things that we've been trying to do. Like the free meals are like one tool in which we can draw people back into the political process. Like, yeah, that's kind of a broader challenge that we're facing. And even if you do give people opportunities to engage, like not everyone is going to decide to do that.
No, exactly. We'll hopefully have time to unpack that technology question a bit more in the open discussion. I might move on to the next question, which is, what do you think is the balance of responsibility for building and using participatory democratic processes between elected reps and their offices, the state or federal party and branches? So really, this is a question of like, should MPs' officers have to do all the work in drafting up these questions and also deciding which bills should be the subject of a vote? Should you be faced with all the labor of providing the explanatory memorandum and information, or should volunteers in the party be doing that work? Or maybe the party needs to be employing people to do that work. Like, do you have a thought on this, Amy?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think like the first thing comes to mind is just the time constraints in an electorate office and the time constraints of the parliamentary team
You
as
wouldn't
well.
want to leave this up to a
And
volunteer committee that's really time poor, hey? Or,
yeah, but like even if the responsibility came to the office, like we were struggling to just do the basics that we needed to do, and to find like the space there for like in a state electorate office for crossbenchers, you get 3 staff who run the electorate office and 1 parliamentary policy officer. And that person's job is to look at all bits of legislation, to be writing speeches, to be meeting stakeholders, and finding additional space. If we were to be consulting on every bill, that would be very difficult. But it's not to say that that isn't the right place for that work to be happening. And
so are you leaning away from, like, you don't think the party should take this on and just tell the MPs how to vote?
Yeah, I think there is probably some role for something like the Parliamentary Liaison Committee to be doing this work. Like if we could have said to the PLC, like, this bill is coming up, can you go away and do a survey of members and bring us back some feedback on what members think? That would be great. And you know, we could then fold that into our decision making. But we didn't always have the time to do that, and PLC wasn't set up to be able to do that. And like, we would really only need to be asking questions on a handful of bills that fall outside of Greens policy.
Oh man, there's so much to say on all this stuff, but we've got to keep racing through these questions. The next one says, you've spoken about a bill you're familiar with, the coercive control bill. What about other bills? To what extent do MPs in general understand the legislation they vote on? Does the committee system inform members? Do other MPs just follow committee recommendations? This is a lot of questions, Stephen. This isn't just one question. On the 2024 federal bills, which we eventually pass, I presume that means the housing bills, how do we weigh up the policy itself against the long run political consequences? That's a lot to unpack. But it might also be useful, Amy, for you to flesh out the portfolio responsibilities of, like, in say the federal parliament, there's a bunch of Green senators and they each have their specific portfolios that they're responsible for. But even at the state level, you and Michael each had a set of portfolios. And I understand that generally Michael would defer to your judgment on the portfolios that you were responsible for, and vice versa.
Yeah, I couldn't speak for how it happens federally, but like for that term, Michael and I each had a ton of portfolios.
A lot.
Part of the challenge. And yeah, then we would largely be leaving the responses to those bills up to whichever office was responsible. But for anything more controversial, we would definitely be working together, and like talking to each other, talking with our staff, and connecting with those like stakeholders who were important on those particular bills.
And does the committee process? Oh, sorry, you've got.
My question was really directed at MPs in general, not just Greens. To what extent? I don't know how many there are in Queensland. To what extent do they understand what's sitting in front of them when they vote, or to what extent are they just following the committee recommendation?
Yeah. Look, I would say if you are in a party, Labor and the LNP, you're told how to vote. You don't need to do any more work on it. And I would guess that every MP would get sent out, like, these are some key points you can put in your speeches, and build your own speeches around that, because you would listen to debate sometime and you just hear the same things over and over and over again. So I think if you're a backbencher in Labor or the LNP, like, you are there's not really a requirement on you to be doing the intellectual work. Like a lot of that would be done for you. Like I couldn't say in detail, and this is not to say that each MP isn't taking bills seriously and doing some of their own work. And you could definitely see where people had, there was particular interest in something, or it was impacting their community in a particular way, that people were engaging with things deeply. But if you look in Hansard or you listen to Parliament, there is a lot of bills that go, this is the Public Transport Amendment Bill, and what this bill does is blah, 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 blah. You're reading out the explanatory notes and just basically reading like, this is what the bill is, rather than any sort of analysis or response. And I think for a lot of backbenchers, you can then you don't really need to be engaging too deeply with most bits of legislation, and you can just be using those notes and remembering also that like MPs don't have to speak on every bill, and so you could make the assumption that if there's a Labor or LNP backbencher who didn't speak on a bill, they might really know not much about it at all. And like we've certainly have seen some comments like there had been some legislation around something to do with fossil fuels. I can't remember the details of this, so the story isn't going to be great, but there was definitely like a vote that happened on the way that Labor were approving coal and gas. And there was then a Labor MP who was saying, I've never voted for a coal mine. And it was like, well, actually, you voted for this legislation that like provides the pathway. And if if you aren't engaging with things deeply, and also to note that the crossbench get allocated a parliamentary staffer, but the crossbench don't. The crossbench just get their 3 EO staff, and then the assumption is that the resources that the party gets, that the deputy premier and premier gets, is doing a lot of that policy work. That means that like individual backbenchers don't need to have an extra staff to help them navigate this. And I'll just touch on the committee process that you've mentioned there as well, Stephen. Like the committee process is, because Queensland doesn't have an upper house, the committee system was set up as a way to have some sort of oversight, and it is really a sham because the committees are all chaired by government members. And so there is no doubt that any bill will be passed by the committee because there's enough government members, and the government chair has the final vote. And so you never see bills that the recommendation from the committee isn't that this be passed. And at the very best, the committee process would result in some amendments to bills. But beyond that, really not much.
Controlling the agenda, yeah.
Yeah. So like that system really isn't that onerous, and if you aren't on that committee, you wouldn't be engaging in any of the there's like sessions where stakeholders come in, and there's hearings where they're asked questions. And sometimes MPs will go on like field trips to look at things, or they'd have like particular bits of engagement with community groups. But if you're not on that committee, you wouldn't know really any of that stuff is going on, and you're unlikely to be engaging with it in much depth. And so for those other MPs, they would literally just be following what their party tells them in terms of vote yes or vote no.
Hey, I'm mindful of time, and I do want to make time for group discussions. So what we'll do is end the recording for group discussion, and then people can speak as freely as they want without fear of it being used against them later. But Amy, did you have any final thoughts before we wrap up this segment of the session? Do you think it's a good idea to be doing more of these sorts of votes like you did for the coercive control bill?
Yeah, I think it is worthwhile, and like that's another kind of important bit of information that MPs could be getting when making decisions. yeah, I think more engagement from the membership is helpful. And just thinking about like our offices, Michael's office and my office would like sometimes get some engagement from Greens members, but not in a significant way. So if there were like other pathways by which members could be talking about things, and I think on top of like decision making about responses to particular bits of legislation, the other question that we've sort of touched on here is like party engagement with our kind of tactical responses to bills. Like, are we going to be pushing for amendments? Are we going to be, trying to negotiate things? Are we going to be using this particular bill as like a media moment? I think that's the other kind of important point that would be useful to be able to engage with the membership on. Like, when should we be like hitting the big red button, and where can we be dealing with things in like a sort of like insider track kind of approach? And there'll be differences of opinions in terms of what we decide to do strategically with different bits of legislation.
Great note to end on. Thank you for that, Amy, and thank you so much again for your time and for sharing your thoughts so openly. I really appreciate it. All right, wrapping up the recording there.